I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions.
Certainly a fired up Senator Chuck Schumer outside the Supreme Court in the day. The justices made their oral arguments on the Louisiana abortion case that would require doctors to have admission privileges at a hospital that in order to do the procedures. Effectively, that would force 2 of the state's only clinics to close. That would leave a single clinic for the entire state to serve women, and it is looking like the justices are split, meaning Chief Justice John Roberts likely could decide the case. And speaking of Roberts, he issued a statement reprimanding Senator Schumer, saying his comments were inappropriate, dangerous, and they threatened judicial independence. The political food fight over this shows just how polarized even the high court has become. Well, today, Schumer, he clarified, or attempted to, his comments.
Now, I should not have used the words I used yesterday. They didn't come out the way I intended to. My point was that there would be political consequences.
But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is not giving Schumer the benefit of the doubt.
The minority leader of the United States Senate threatened 2 associate justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, period. There's no other way to interpret that.
And what would a controversy be in Washington without a tweet from our president? This is what Donald Trump had to say. I remind you, he is a person who has criticized judges at every level here on a variety of issues. He tweeted this about Schumer, quote, "There can be few things worse in a civilized, law-abiding nation than the United States Senator openly and for all to hear and see threatening the Supreme Court or its justices. This is what Chuck Schumer just did. He must pay a severe price for this." For what it's worth, you note here that Trump used the same exact languages as Schumer, paying a price. So was he threatening the Senate Minority Leader? And we continue to digress. The abortion case that has spurred this whole mess is not the only controversial issue on the Supreme Court docket. At the end of March, the justices will begin oral arguments on 3 cases involving access to President Trump's taxes and financial documents. Also, the justices will begin the Obamacare case in October, and they should make a ruling in the spring of 2021. The whole ACA could in fact be in jeopardy. Plus, cases on controversial issues like religious freedom and discrimination and public corruption, Bridgegate being the impetus for it, they're all on the docket. My next guest, the perfect person to discuss this. She just wrote the cover piece for the New York Times Magazine called "How Will Trump's Supreme Court Remake America?" It's about how the conservative justices that Trump appointed are taking the court to the far right. Staff writer at the Times Magazine section, Emily Bazelon, she joins me now. And Emily, this piece obviously written before the latest, dust up that we saw on the Hill, but nonetheless, in the opening arguments, the questions that came from the justices seemed very telling in the Louisiana case. What was your takeaway? Because it certainly got some animated reaction by some of the progressive justices like Justice Ginsburg and others.
Yes, the arguments were really interesting. So what's happening in Louisiana is trying to implement a law that requires abortion providers to have admitting privileges at a local hospital. That sounds kind of innocuous. The problem is the doctors can't get those privileges, not because they've done anything wrong. Sometimes it's just because they don't actually ever send patients to the hospital because abortion is a very safe procedure. And so this is a kind of red tape requirement that states have used in order to force clinics to close. The Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional in 2016. At that point, Chief Justice John Roberts wanted to uphold the Texas law. But now in Louisiana, 4 years later, he wanted to know what the benefits of this law would be for Louisiana that would be different from Texas. And that's important because the whole scientific consensus from the American Medical Association and other doctors' organizations is that there is no medical benefit for women. It suggested that Roberts was looking at this case in a different way and could be the swing vote.
I want you to explain a term here, textualism and why it's so important. And I'll give a little bit of the backdrop, because in your piece you talk about the Stevens case. And while it's not important to our conversation now, it kind of sets the stage, as I understand, Emily, and correct me, which is this was a person who, after a lot of soul searching, decided that they were going to transition. And they notified their employer that when they came back from the procedure, they would be in their new gender, if you will. To that end, the employer fired them. And then they brought a case for workplace discrimination, went all the way to the Supreme Court. In the questioning, Justice Gorsuch said, listen, I'm going to look at this from basically a textualist standpoint, how it's written in the Constitution, no interpretation on my part. How do we use sex for this? And basically the attorney, as I got it, for the plaintiff in this case said, glad you asked. You don't have to go there. This is pretty straightforward. And if it ended there, as you write, it probably would have been a 5-4 decision in favor of that displaced worker. But then he pivoted and he said, how should a judge, quote, take into consideration the massive social upheaval that would be entailed in such a decision? To the layperson, it seems like he, and maybe Kavanaugh, but certain other people, they want it both ways. They want what's written in black and white in the Constitution, but then they want to have the social considerations simultaneously. Those two approaches seem to be in conflict with one another.
Yeah, so you have Amy Stevens, a trans woman who gets fired during her transition. And the question is, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is our super important employment discrimination law, was she fired, quote, because of sex? That's the words in the statute. And so when you think about the experience of becoming trans and how much that is bound up in one's sexual identity and in one's sex, does that single focus on the text, which is what Justice Gorsuch claims determines his decisions, does that require Justice Gorsuch to say, yes, she was fired because of her sex, and thus federal law should from now on all across the country be read to protect transgender employees who are fired for being trans? That would not seem to be the outcome that a very conservative justice would be wanting to reach. And so you see Justice Gorsuch in the argument make this pivot where suddenly he's asking about what he calls, quote, massive social upheaval. It's a strange moment because it seems to be in tension with his own methodology as a judge, and also because actually trans people in lots of parts of the country have had these kinds of protections from employment discrimination from lower courts for 20 years. So there really is no massive social upheaval. There's no evidence for that that's apparent.
This is not even, I think, opinion at this point. The president for 3 years consistently has had a huge problem with an independent judiciary. I mean, from everything from the Justice Department to the courts, et cetera. Was it the belief, even 3 years ago, that the Supreme Court would have pushed back harder on the idea that there were not 3 co-equal branches of government and the judiciary had to be sacrosanct and outside of politics? I mean, I'm trying to disabuse myself of some of the naivete here, but at the same end, I'm surprised there hasn't been a stronger pushback than there has been from Justice Roberts on all the way down.
Right. Well, I think on the Roberts Court, you have some conservatives who have a very broad theory of presidential power at a moment in which it is President Trump who is asking for more of that power. And there's something unsettling about watching that come into play.
Finally, Emily, if the makeup of the court stays as is, or if there is a change that it's even further cemented with this another conservative appointee, what are some folks' beliefs as to just how substantial some of the changes in the cases that will come before the court that Roberts will put on the docket, that they could change? Just how widespread could this be generationally, potentially?
Well, Supreme Court justices are chosen to be there for 20, 30, 40 years. So these are hugely consequential decisions. 4 justices have the power to put a case on the docket. So it wouldn't even take Roberts to put more dramatic cases in front of the court if President Trump gets another super conservative appointee. So you can imagine that a fourth conservative like that would really make a difference. And then you also have Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh, who are very solid conservatives as well.
Well, it's a fascinating piece. If you haven't checked it out, folks, you should. How will Trump's Supreme Court remake America, in the Times Magazine? Emily, thank you very much for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, everyone, when we come back, we'll wrap things up.